please welcome to the stage Mr. James Roberts.
Thank you. Hello. Oh, I got all the best-looking people together in the room. That was a nice introduction, although you may have kind of been missold what you're about to hear from me, because there'll be questions at the end, and we can go across more than meets the eye and lost light. That's fine. Although this is a little different. This is focusing on, for some of us, the distant past. I'm going to talk to you about the period of time when Transformers came closest to dying. And it ties in with this new book, which tells you a lot more about that era and how we kind of climbed back from the brink as fans. But the origins of this book and this presentation, I guess, was in this room a couple of years ago. Nick Roach and Jack Lawrence and myself were drafted in to do a last-minute panel after somebody, wasn't able to do it, and it was just about our journey from kind of fans to professionals, and it struck me as we were answering one of the questions that people of a certain vintage in the early 90s, when the kind of pillars of the franchise began to crumble, the cartoon first, and then in America the toy range and the comic and so on. That was really when it felt, okay, things are packing up for good. But I think that's the only time that will ever happen, because Transformers now is such a juggernaut and such a pop culture phenomenon that even if, its fortunes may rise and fall, I don't think as fans we're ever going to think that it's on the brink of extinction. But that was not the case back in the early 90s. But I can't summarize the whole book in an hour, so we're going to focus on a little chunk of that era, which, appropriately enough for TFN, is going to be kind of the British fan experience, Britain and Ireland, and what people like myself were going through. And we're trying to gauge what the average age is in the audience. I mean, there's some of my age, so, near death. Yeah. And then there's lots of little innocent, fresh-faced people, just blinking in the light. So that's nice as well. So there's a mixed audience. This is very exciting, actually, I was going to go for the mic, and then I said, you know what, I'm going to go for the kind of Steve Jobs type mouthpiece, and feel very much like Taylor Swift at the O2. Although she focused on the latter half of the 90s Transformers stuff, so it's not that much of a comparison. Right. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to canter through. Dave said to me when we talked about this, he said, you have timed the presentation. I said, I have, but I haven't. So we're going to canter, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. Okay, I don't know if you can read this too well, but this was a letter I got from Hasbro back in August 1990, when precocious young James thought, I'm going to write to Hasbro, and I'm going to make some suggestions as to the toys they could bring out in 1991, because that was the type of helpful young man I was. So I'd been into Transformers about 3.5 years by this point, and I don't know if you can read it all, but the reply from Nicola Thomas says, Dear James, Master James Roberts, I wanted to. So, Dear James, thank you for your recent letter regarding our Transformers range. Unfortunately, I'm unable to reveal what the range will be for 1991, as we do not know ourselves until January. Therefore, I'm unable to tell you whether any quote-unquote Decepticons will be in the next range. Well, I can assure you that I didn't write to Hasbro and say, will you be bringing out any Decepticons in 1991? Because I would have been saying things like, oh, the deluxe Insecticons should be coming out, bring them over here and stuff. But no, they thanked me for my suggestions, and they sent me a little catalogue with that as well. So this was kind of where I was at in August 1990. I was a good few years into the franchise, and I was very fascinated in how there was an American range of toys, and not all of them came to the UK, and so on and so forth. Anyway, we'll start at the very beginning, and then we're going to jump to the end of the 80s. So this was one of the very first adverts for the Transformers comic. It appeared in in-house magazines and trade publications back in spring 1984. And it says, a 4-issue limited series beginning in April. So that's why it's it's ancient because in the end the series was delayed and it didn't come out till May. But that's one of the very first kind of print examples of Transformers. And you had these as well. Across the Marvel US comics in March and April 1984, you had these kind of inserts teasing the launch of the comic. And I just wanted to contextualize things and say, you know, spring 1984, Transformers were not known to the world. It was all brand new. Hasbro didn't know to what extent it was going to be a success, although pre-orders from retailers were insane, very, very good, but they hadn't come into contact with the public yet. So everything to play for, early days. And then we're going to jump ahead to April 1990. So I've skipped the glory days and, you know, the golden age of G1 when it was, for a time, the biggest selling toy, certainly in North America and in Britain. And I'm going to center the British experience now, because in April 1990, with this particular issue, that's when a lot of even hardcore Transformers fans jumped ship. So the UK comic had launched in September '84. It was fortnightly at first, and then it went weekly. And because it needed extra content, because the American reprints weren't enough, it published, you know, the British stories. Originally 11 pages in full color. By this point, probably, over 6 months or more before this, the UK comic had started printing black and white UK stories, 5 pages an issue. So it was a real step down. And the UK strips were famous for being kind of very, slow-burning, epic, long-running, continuity-laden type of stories, mostly by Furman. But by this point, because Furman was writing the US title and the UK title, and the publication schedules were all awry, he kind of created a micro-continuity called Earth Force that tried to mesh with the US stuff, but didn't really. So by this point, it was unmoored from the larger story. It was black and white, and the stories tended to be more of a more humorous bent. And when you're young, unlike now, but when you're young, you're not really after that type of stuff. So when I interviewed many people for Generation Mechs and spoke to people who were there at the time, this issue came up again and again, this particular issue, as the point at which they decided to stop reading the comic. They felt, okay, well, I've outgrown it. It's not for me anymore. And the other thing to say is that it was also reprinting a 16-part Transformers and G.I. Joe crossover, American story, chopped into 16 parts, not a good story at all. So those things combined drove people away. And that's what it did. You see, it was the April Fool gag kind of epitomised. And I want to stress, that Snow Fun is a good story, it's fine, but I think if you'd grown up with the comic, it was so far removed from what you were used to, you thought, okay, I don't know if I recognize this as my Transformers anymore. Then you had the reprint, and then even things like the next week page, when they'd usually trail the next issue and hype it up and tell you what you can expect, it had been replaced with just a picture. So it felt like the editorial voice was changing too. So lots of people in the UK said, okay, that's enough for me. Around about the same time, and I know because we are talking about a dedicated audience, so a lot of you will know this, but 1989, 1990, 91, there were changes to the toy range. In America, it was kind of coming to a sputtering end. And in 1990, they'd launched Action Masters. Interestingly, there was never a UK print advert for Action Masters. So Hasbro UK, or Hasbro Europe, said, we really don't think these things are what Transformers is about. We'll put them out there, and if they sell, great, but our expectations are low. To the extent that, two things, we're not going to spend money on print advertising, and we are going to introduce the Transformers classics. So we're going to reuse the old molds and bring back some of the classic characters because we think that will do better than Action Masters, and so it proved. The editor of Transformers UK, Ewan Peters, that was responsible for the G.I. Joe crossover, reprints, and the switch to black and white and so on, he left in autumn 1990. So Ian Rimmer had been the first, Sheila Cranmer had been the first editor, then Ian Rimmer, then Simon Furman himself was editor. Ewan Peters was Furman's successor. He was a colorist, he became an editor, then he left, and then the title's last editor, Harry Papadopoulos, took over around now. And by this point, there was no more British strips. So it was kind of symptomatic of the brand running out of steam in the UK. TF UK couldn't justify the expense behind producing new strips, so it was reprinting old UK strips, but there was still American material being printed. And the good news was that Furman by now was really into his stride in terms of the American stories. He brought in Jeff Senior, and then Andrew Wildman and others, and some of the very best American stories were being printed. So that helped kind of resuscitate Transformers UK. It switched format. It was now full color again, and just as the Snow Fun episode was when people jumped off, a lot of people started coming back. A lot of the hardcore fans started coming back around now. Papadopoulos decided that, and he was smart actually, Papadopoulos, because he knew the toys were still going in the UK, but they weren't. They were not attracting new fans in the way that they used to. And the comic, the UK comic, was surviving principally because of a hardcore, aging fan base. People like me, who by this point were probably 14 years old. And the comic became, under Papadopoulos' editorial tenure, it became a question of holding on to the older fans. So what did he do? He commissioned more painted covers. Some of these are recycled. That one's a very old one for a calendar, repurposed. That's an American one, recolored. But you can see it strikes a slightly more mature balance compared to what had come before. And what you've got there on the left is the last Marvel UK in-house Transformers advert, a repurposed cover, Rodin's The Thinker, but it appeared in titles like The Knights of Pendragon, which were definitely aimed at kind of 14, 15, 16-year-olds. And, it started having these kind of more impressionistic covers. This is, the 21st Century Schizoid is a pun, as I'm sure everybody in the room knows, of a King Crimson song, a King Crimson album track, and probably 0.001% of readers' dads knew what that joke was. But there we go. Right, anyway, so now it gets interesting. So I'll read this out. We got a little Jason Wagner there from Edinburgh with a letter. Whatever happened to him? The tragedies that befell Jason, we can't dwell on now, but he pulled back from the brink. Anyway, at this point, the readers knew that the American comic, not all the readers, but enough readers knew that the American comic was coming to an end. And so, uniquely for a British comic, you had a readership that had a sense of the comic's own mortality. Normally these things the comic would just stop, or traditionally you'd get kind of great news inside, and there'd be news of the dying comic merging with another one. But uniquely, Transformers UK readers, certainly after letters like these, knew that its days were literally numbered. Can I read it very well? So, so there we go. So Jason helpfully says, the American Transformers is stopping. Finito. Forever. Now for the big question, does this mean that UK Transformers will be finishing at the same time? I hope the answer is no. And then, so this is most likely Papadopoulos replying as Blaster. It isn't actually Blaster. He'd left by this point because they couldn't afford him. So since Marvel US revealed that they would be canning Transformers in the States, we've received many letters from worried and frantic readers deeply concerned about the fate of this comic. We have enough Yankee material to last until the end of '91. What happens after that? Well, wait and see. So what was going on behind the scenes was a kind of ongoing argument between Papadopoulos and the so-called Boys Adventure Titles team and Paul Neary, who'd been brought in to kind of resuscitate Marvel UK, which was in the doldrums at this point. And Paul Neary was not a fan of Transformers. He was not a fan, in particular, of licensed titles. So Marvel UK, ironically, because of the success of Transformers from 1984, had kind of put nearly all of its chips, all of its eggs, if you like, in the same basket, which was, licensed properties. So you had, some successes. Real Ghostbusters was a big success for Marvel UK. But the likes of Visionaries didn't do too well, Galaxy Rangers didn't do too well. They tried and tried again with Action Force, didn't really take off. So Paul Neary was thinking, okay, there isn't really a future there. We're too dependent on licensed properties. But Transformers UK was doing okay, and by this point it was cheap to produce because it was relying on pre-existing material. But it was a weird time to be a UK fan because by this point the American toy range had stopped, and we didn't really, or few of us knew it at the time, but 1991's toy range was a hybrid. So you had the kind of Action Masters that would have come out in the US had the range continued, and then you had the latest kind of mixture of Transformers classics, and then you had some repurposed Japanese toys like Overlord, which originally come out in '88. And there was just a combination of readers knowing that the end was probably near, knowing that the American toys had ended, the toy range, and having this kind of weird hybridized UK range, it made for a strange time. Anyway, issue 330. Fantastic news for everybody. Contrary to expectations, Transformers UK was not going to end. It was going to be relaunched as a monthly, or it was going to go monthly from issue 333. So big news. Acknowledges, as I say, everyone thinks that the end is nigh. Very unusual for a UK comic to be in that position. But 333, 36-page monthly, some recolored Transformers UK stories, but some brand new Transformers stories. 5 pages, it's not much, but it was better than nothing. And it was going to carry on after the events of the US title. So Furman was going to write this new series set on Cybertron after the events of US issue 80. Lovely. And everybody, certainly all the readers and people in the fan club, which is what I'm going to talk about next, were very happy. Until 2 issues later, when they said, actually, no, change of plan. It is going to end. This is the last issue. And this wasn't written by Papadopoulos. He'd been let go by this point, as had the entire Boys Adventure titles team. So there was a kind of Night of the Long Knives. And only, I think, John Freeman, who was Doctor Who magazine editor, survived the cull, and he was given extra responsibility. But yeah, in between that last issue and this one, people were sacked. This is written by somebody else, don't know who it is. The editorial voice is different. But that was that. That was the end of the UK comic. 7.5 years. Kind of an ignoble end, although it continued as specials for another 3 years. And then, the cartoon had finished in America after the Rebirth, the Headmaster series in '87. It didn't have a strong terrestrial showing in the UK, as some of you will know. It survived. It existed as videos. This is probably the last UK video that came out in early 1992. So it was a single episode from season 3, which by this point was 7 years old. And like I say, everything was just winding down. The UK comic had finished. The toy line, well, we didn't know what 1992 was going to hold, was going to herald, because 91 was such a mixed bag. The specials continued for a few more years, just reprinting old stuff, less and less of a kind of editorial grasp on the type of thing they were printing. Very little attention was paid to it. And I've put that up there for the kind of people of a certain vintage like me to say that that was the original version of the annual cover there. The last Transformers annual, published in 1991, although called the 1992 annual because that was the convention. Right. Okay, that's the extended preamble. That's setting the scene of kind of the official state of play. So everything's powering down or dead. Hasbro UK had told Marvel, and Marvel had passed it on to the readers just before the end of the comic, that the tour range would continue for at least another couple of years. So we kind of had that, but it was, surely just delaying the inevitable. Okay, so what did we as fans do about it? Well, the fan story, in many respects, starts with this issue, which I don't think any of you would have seen before. It's from 1940. And what is special about this particular issue is that it's the first American comic ever to have a letters page in it. And letters pages did appear in the likes of Amazing Stories and other kind of genre publications. and they'd launched in the 20s those publications. And what was interesting is that often the correspondent's full address would be printed, and that enabled other readers to correspond with them and share an interest. And so a kind of community outside of these publications, predicated on a shared interest, but a community began to develop. And in the comics industry, from the 1940s onwards, smart people thought, actually, that's a good way of fostering loyalty and retaining a readership and kind of building a sense of community. So we'll start publishing letters, and we'll start publishing readers' addresses in full. Now, you might think it's an unusual and potentially risky thing to do, to publish the full address, house name, and so on and so forth, of readers that tend to be children. And you'd be right in thinking that, because it is a dangerous thing to do, and there was a concerted campaign in America to stop comic companies doing that, because the campaigners said it would be a way of unscrupulous kind of marketeers to peddle unsavory things to kids. And DC stopped publishing readers' addresses in full, but Marvel didn't. Marvel essentially weighed up the risks and said, actually, we'd rather foster that community of engaged readers, so we're going to keep doing it, thanks. And it never got to the point where it was illegal to do that, so they kept on doing it. So let's jump back to Transformers UK. This is in the kind of doldrums, so to speak, the black and white era, the snow fun era. And before I get to the main letter on this page, I'd like to point to Stephen Mapes, who, yeah. So it's a small world. It's either a small world, or the people that were motivated enough to write into the comic just never really shook it off and just, stayed in the fandom. Actually, the next issue's got a letter from me in it, but there's no point showing you that. It's very earnest. I think I literally say how many toys I've got, so that's the level. So, actually, Stephen, you write a very informative letter there explaining about Five Faces of Darkness and so on. But this is the one that matters. This is the one that counts. So you've got Leanne Elliott, an American, writing in to say that she used to be able to get the British comic imported into specialist comic shops, but that's stopped, and she misses it, and she wondered whether any UK readers would be able to help her out. But the most interesting thing in the letter is when she talks about, at the end, an American fan and a member of Transmasters, a Transformers fan club, and she does ask for her full address to be printed, and it is. And that is the point at which organized UK fandom is born, with the publication of that letter from Leanne. And 10 people precisely responded to that letter and wrote to Leanne and said, tell me more about Transmasters and how can I join? And I wasn't one of them. However, in issue 311, there was a second opportunity for people like me. So John Blip Moore, wrote in and said, lots of news for you. There's going to be new Transformers being produced. There'll be a second universe miniseries, which is like a profile book. There may be a second movie. Everyone was obsessed with there being a second movie. And it's amazing, actually, in hindsight, how deluded we were in 1991, thinking, yeah, of course they're going to do. I mean, because the first one did so well. There was also a rumor, actually, in the American fanzines that there was an uncut 10-hour version of the animated movie, which, even with a rudimentary grasp of how animation works, you'd be thinking that's economically unlikely. Anyway, so John says, in Transmasters, every member has their own universe of events. You are very popular, Blaster. If we joined all the universes together, you'd have 4 wives and 12 children. So, prefiguring modern fandom in so many ways, I think. Very much, but yeah, true. So, if you'd like to know more, write to me, write to John Moore. And I did that time. And I think it was because by this point, it really did seem as if everything was collapsing, and this was the last chance to kind of keep in touch with people when the comic finished. So I wrote to John, And I've still got the envelope that because it was very exciting, because that may seem like nothing, particularly in the year 2025, but getting something in the early 90s with a kind of, in this case, a jazz stamp on it, just made me think, oh my God, there are other people out there that care about Transformers still, like I do. Power to the masters, John says. So, by the way, so all this stuff, the information that John has imparted all came from the latest issue of an American fanzine. That's where it became apparent down the line he'd kind of taken it all from there. The wives and children thing is because in the American Transmasters in the early days, they didn't have a shared continuity. They each had their own universe. Each member created their own kind of avatar or Transformers character. And because the popular characters, the official ones, were in such high demand, and shipping was a big thing, you had lots of these kind of relationships. So there's John's letter to me saying, welcome to the club. I'm 16 and a half. I thought we'd moved beyond halves at that point, but then he says, I'm the younger. He said to me, you're going to be the youngest. Yeah, you will probably be the youngest member in the UK. Please don't let that worry you. There's a UK newsletter called Trans Talk, 50p, blah, blah. So this was extremely exciting to me. So I dived into Transmasters UK, as it was now called. So John was the head officer of the UK branch. There was only about 15 people in Transmasters UK at the time, but John was one of the people who'd replied to Leanne Elliott's letter. And that is issue 1 of Trans Talk, the first ever UK unofficial Transformers newsletter. June 1991, and it talks about the fanzines that you could get in America at the time, the likes of Matrix Master, which was a comic strip, a strip zine, and Transverse, which was a kind of text-based story zine. And yeah, it's very, it's old school fanzine, it's typed, it's photocopied, it'll do. It was extremely exciting to me to get that. And inside Trans Talk, there was news of a British comic, an unofficial UK comic that members would create, and it would run alongside the official one, because TF UK was still going, and it would be called Transmission. So this is the advert for this exciting new fanzine that was going to come out. Due out in July 1991, it was delayed because fanzines always are delayed. But anyway, the intent was there. We'll come back to Transmission in a minute. John Moore left the club quickly. There's a story behind that, really, but essentially he was going to set up another club. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the UK couldn't sustain 2 unofficial Transformers clubs in those days. So John left, and Andy Dornan, who was co-editor of Trans Talk, took over and became sole editor, and Andy had better computer software than John. So we had this phenomenal, professional UK newsletter, Trans Talk issue 4, and what can we see? Think of this as a snapshot of the fandom in 1991. So we've got fantastic news, the UK comic is going to carry on, great. There we are. So of course this was just before the axe fell, but accurate information there about the foreseeable future. Now, I didn't just put it up there because my name's there, but it does say thanks to James Roberts for this information. So I phoned Marvel, because you could do that in those days. And I was the type of guy that would write to Hasbro and say, have you thought about bringing the deluxe Insecticons over? So I thought, well, so I spoke to Harry Papadopoulos, and he'd said, this is the plan. I mean, it wasn't a long conversation, but it was enough. And, at the time, it was accurate. What else have we got? What's going on? What's concerning people? The Japanese Transformers was a huge thing, as you can imagine, for UK fans who wouldn't have known about them until joining Transmasters, most likely. The 1991 Japanese range was built around Star Convoy. Not long had a renaissance. It's been brought out again. And this is quite quaint. It tells you the scale of both the fandom and the franchise back in 91. We've done a list. We've done a list of every Transformer. There we go. From Abominus to Zetar, Power Dasher. Yes, and then there was elections. That was hugely preoccupied the American branch of Transmasters, but we were a little bit more relaxed about it. Anyway, that's what counted for news back then. So Transmission issue 1 was delayed, but eventually came out in January 1992. You can ignore the cover date. And the story was set in the Marvel UK universe. That was a blend of the American Transformers comics and the UK ones. So that was kind of the most complete continuity at the time. So it was a text story and a strip, and it was set within that continuity, and it involved Transmasters OCs, original characters, going back, the Time Commandos, going back to the Ark in 1984 and trying to stop Cyclonus and Scourge killing the crew, the Autobots on the Ark, which, not too dissimilar from where Beast Wars went a few years later. Transtalk became Transword. After Transword, it became Informer, and that's how it stayed for the next 3-4 years. And I've put this up here because Deaths Are Us, the first item, it's news of the 1992 Transformers range, which was the first Euro range, the first time that a toy range had been designed explicitly and exclusively for the European market. So still cancelled in America, but Hasbro Europe, after a lot of number crunching and speaking to other territories, decided it probably was worth a roll of the dice. And so we had they had the Turbo Masters and the Predators, and we had some older toys repurposed as well. But that was the lead item on there. And then, of course, the confirmation of the end of the comic as well. And Right. So Transmission only lasted 1 issue because the editor and the creator left with John Moore. And a guy called Matt Dallas, who was one of the first kind of 10, 12 people to join the club, an aspiring artist and storyteller, decided that Transmasters UK needed a comic and he would do it. So he'd produced a story for Transmission, which wasn't printed because it ended. So he decided, on the advice of Andy Dornan, who was the new head officer, to make his own comic. And this became Transmasters UK's flagship comic, read by pretty much all the members. And by this point, the membership was growing because the UK comic had finished, and I know that people went back over the old issues and saw John Moore's letter and wrote. And so, membership was growing. So set in 2032, that's Matt's art there. And before we go a bit further into the kind of story side, I just want to show you this. This is what very much pre-internet passed as the kind of continuity guide. If you were a UK fan and you were creating fanfic or you were drawing Transformers stories in the early 90s. So this was just how all the stories fitted together and where you could fit your own stories into them. Transstrip went from strength to strength. Matt developed a really kind of far-reaching kind of space epic set on Nebulous, centered on Scorponok, who had died in the Unicron War in 1991. By 2032, he was resurrected. Matt had been inspired by the 1991 toy catalogue that you got if you sent off for this wall chart. And in the catalogue was the Action Master Elite Double Punch, which was taken to be Scorponok at the time. So Scorponok was the central character, and Matt made sure that the Predators were the big bad, the villains of Transstrip, because he was such a fan of the UK comic, and he knew that if the UK comic had carried on, it would have done the job of promoting the latest toys. It became more and more popular, and Matt became more ambitious with his storytelling, and he reprinted the early issues here. So you've got an advert there from one of the UK zines for the first 6 issues. And because, by this point, not to belabor the point, the Marvel story was dead, the official story was dead, there was going to be no more fiction. So it became, it's up to the fans what to do with it. And so we took that responsibility really seriously. And what Transmasters UK did uniquely was purely collaborative. So we all made sure that the fanfic we were writing complemented existing stories and other members' stories. So we all worked together to kind of expand this grand narrative. And one of the most pressing issues, if you're a fan in these days, was how could Unicron attack in 1991, and how could the movie still happen? And everybody wanted the movie to still happen because A, it was amazing, and secondly, it actually was responsible for Target 2006, which was kind of the most universally beloved of the UK strips. So issue 7 and 8, I think, of Transstrip tackled that. Matt won't mind me saying that it wasn't most imaginative use. It was a mind wipe type of thing. Their memories were wiped, whatever, but it did the job. It put a plaster on it. I started producing my own fanzines around this time. The main fanzine I produced was called Transtext. That's an advert for Transtext, which was, as the title suggests, prose-based. But prior to that, I did a 3-issue mini-series. My first kind of substantial fanfic was the Polyhex Wars, which I did in 1992. And that's back when I used to draw as well. I used to draw Transformers things too. And I rapidly gave up. And that's one thing about joining a club. You see there's lots of people more talented than you. And I'm not advising that you do this, but in my case, you kind of think, okay, well, I'll stop doing that. So yeah, this was Transtext. It ran for about 18 months. It was a onerous undertaking because there was they became very chunky, the issues, and I was using my dad's photocopier to produce them. But we did things like, most of the stories were by me. I'd say about 60% of the stories were mine. Other people contributed. We had a continuation of the Earth Force stories, which we'd kind of learned to live with by this point. Invasion was a very long story that was eventually reworked into Eugenesis, which was a kind of self-published Transformers novel that I put out in 2001, and which in a kind of roundabout way helped to introduce me to IDW, so the threads are there. And the newsletters continued. So, we were now into 92. We were learning about the 1993 range, and we were also learning about this, Transformers Generation 2, or Transformers the second generation, as it was going to be called back then, certainly as it was referred to in-house at Hasbro. And Andy Dornan, who was still the editor, and a couple of other people in the club had really good contacts by this point. They had contacts within Hasbro, they had contacts within Takara, and most of the kind of news was accurate. It was solid. So this was one of the first times we heard about it as UK fans. The UK club grew and more fiction was produced. I won't go into all of it now, but you had other titles like Pathformers coming out, and they'd be set. You'd pick an underexplored portion of the continuity and you'd tell stories about it. So Pathformers was set pre-war. It merged with Transstrip, as you can see there. And Transstrip went from strength to strength, and I chose this at cover because it's lovely and quaint. So we're celebrating over 9 years of Transform. Not quite 10, but, there we are in 93. And I don't know, that makes me feel really, really old. The 9th anniversary. Why did I choose this cover? Oh, yeah, okay, so that was confirmation of what was now Transformers Generation 2. We knew that at first, some of the old toys would be reissued, didn't know what would follow. There's a lot of rumor in the trans fandom about this 115-episode new series that was going to come out. And it was mentioned in an article in Brand Week, so it had some kind of official ballast attached to it. Couldn't work out what it was going to be. You'll know, some of you, that it ended up being hugely underwhelming. It was just a kind of CGI-enhanced repeat of the first couple of seasons of the American cartoon. But back then, rumor was rife, and there was even talk, you can't read it, it's too small, but it was going to be Headmasters, Master Force, and Victory redubbed. That was going to be the new adventures of the Transformers. Transformers The Lost Episodes. In 93 was the first crossover within the club, so multiple creators came together to tell a 6-issue story set in the future in the year 1996. I don't know if you can imagine what that would be like, but vastly different to 1993, that's for sure. And while that was running, Transstrip came to an end. So, and very unusually for a fanzine, it ended when it wanted to, and it ended by finishing the story. So you had a 2.5-year story wrapped up as intended. but not before there was collaborations with the American club. So we had Microzone, which was a US story, a US creator that teamed up with Matt. We started to incorporate the Generation 2 into what had been, what we thought was a kind of a dormant fictional universe, but now we had to make tweaks. We had to bring in the newly designed Megatron. That's the last issue of Transstrip and the last page of Transstrip, wrapping things up really nicely. And then Generation 2 ended. So that's a panel from the last issue of G2 in America. It lasted 12 issues. They knew that it was going to be cancelled pretty early on. I think it was announced on the letters page in issue 8. And the UK club then was faced with a question. So what do we do? Because surely, if G2 was a miracle, for there to be a reboot, because back in those days, that didn't really happen, with the exception of He-Man. The He-Man reboot had also, or the refresh had failed. G2 was never supposed to happen. Now it's collapsed. Toys aren't selling well. The comic's been canned. That's definitely the end of the road. So the UK club thought, well, we want to keep the story going. So we are going to carry on the American comic. So we have Transformers Generation 2, issue 13, picking up where the story left off. And I'm not going to say much more about this because this really marks the beginning of the golden age of the UK fandom. And you've got new creators coming into the fold, such as Nick Roach and Jack Lawrence, and contributing to what became the flagship title of the club and lasted over 6 years. And just to wrap up before I take questions, I showed you the kind of handwritten continuity guide from the beginning of the kind of organized fandom, when it was 95% published stories and a handful of kind of fanfic. Well, this is just one part of the writer's guide that was published in Transformers Generation 2, issue 13. One of several pages just bursting with all the fanfic, the interconnected, complementary fanfiction that had been written by dozens and dozens of people over the last 3 years. So it had really grown as a kind of cohesive, interconnected universe. So I've chosen like a snippet, and I've raced through it because there's lots more I'd love to tell you about. I mean, I've focused on the UK club. There was an American club, and it was a far more kind of tumultuous, rocky road, far more internal fighting in the American club for various reasons. A different emphasis. They were very much cartoon fans first, comic fans second. I've also not mentioned the other fan clubs, because it wasn't just Transmasters. There was other clubs springing up, particularly around G2. So I've been quite curatorial, because we've only had a little bit of time together. This is obviously a plug, and such an elegant and subtle one. But the full story is in Generation Mechs. So what Gen Mechs does, it's not just an analysis of the growth of fandom. It's intended for kind of I'd say non-Transformers fans, none of you. If you don't know what Transformers is, then the beginning of the book traces in painstaking detail the rise and the demise of Transformers G1. So I'm really fascinated by how things stop being successful and the early signs of kind of failure and fatigue. It's particularly interesting when you know it's got a happy ending. But yeah, I go into the detail of the rise and decline, and then the growth of fandom, which has its origins in the kind of really thick fan fiction kind of Bibles that were produced in the 70s and 80s. I could go on, but you'll see it's all in here. It isn't just me pontificating. There's lots of interviews with fanzine editors and creators, comics creators from then and now, Hasbro executives that worked on the 92 and 93 ranges and that were responsible for the decisions that led to the creation of a European exclusive range. So lots of stuff in there. Anyway, yeah, I've got some. If you're interested, I've got some. But I think that's it from me. And I think we've got about, 10 minutes. So you don't have to ask me about fandom stuff. You can ask about all the Meet CI stuff as well. I just hope there is some questions, otherwise, yes. Oh, hello, Jim.
Can you shut up and take my money? How can we buy your book?
Great, okay. Well, that's like a plant, isn't it? And front row as well.
I really want to know.
Yeah, okay. I've got, so the books are here. The books are at my table. I hadn't actually handled one until a few hours ago because I hadn't seen it in print. But yeah, they've been delivered thanks to the organisers. And it's an expensive undertaking, so I don't see myself doing another print run of the hardback. So once they're sold, they're sold. But yeah, they're here. Yes, because you seem very eager. We've got a very long arm. Oh, we've got a mic heading to you. Sorry, is that a tarn? Yeah, you're holding up a tarn. Yeah, okay. That's going to guarantee my attention.
Do you still remember one of our first unofficial convention, Transforce 2000?
Yes.
What did you think of it overall at that time?
What did I think of it? That was my first ever convention, full stop, actually, and my first Transformers convention. And I met Simon Furman for the first time, I think I was there in 2001 as well. 2001 is when I brought you Genesis to sell, so nothing changes. But yeah, 2000, I saw Simon Furman, and I remember, because we were all, as we still are, Simon Furman is the man. And I remember walking back from we'd been out to eat, a lot of us, and we were walking back to the hotel, and I, for some reason, decided to ask him about brute force, which will mean something to only a tiny handful of people in the room. But it was a very, very obscure strip that he'd written after Transformers. But yeah, I've got good memories of Transforce. I think that's when I met Jack Lawrence for one of the first times as well. We got some round here, so yeah, sorry. That's, okay, I'm going to answer more quickly.
Sorry. Is there any particular reason you think things were maybe a wee bit nicer in the UK zine scene compared to America?
Good question, and it is explored in the book, but I'll tell you now. It was I think to do firstly with the size. So there was fewer of us, and it was easier to have meetups. But the main reason actually was because of the connective tissue that the UK comic amounted to. Because the cartoon cut-through wasn't that great. It was chopped up and broadcast on ITV for a few episodes, and then it was kind of videos only. So unlike in the US where there was competing stories, we just had one story, and it came out every week. And there's fan media studies that will tell you about the importance of kind of paratexts, which are these things, in this case, which exist outside the toy range, but give it life. And so I think because we were basically all reading it. So I think that helped. For whatever reason, we were all a bit younger, and as you'll see, the US fandom kind of came from TV genre fandom, and it was kind of just a different way of doing it, but mainly because we had one thing in common. But having said that, it is still quietly miraculous that we didn't. There were some fallings out, but we generally got along well. I guess. Oh, say it again. What's the dominant? Genres and subjects of these fanfics back then? Right, good question. Okay, so there was a real distinction between what the American fans were writing about and what the UK fans were writing about. And I'm not making, I'm not saying, not pitting them against each other or saying one is more valid than the other. But the American fans were absolutely about. There was a lot of what we'd now call rather disparagingly Mary Sue's, a lot of self-inserts. There'd be a lot of found family stuff. There'd be kind of torture, a lot of torture. Kind of proto-furry stuff as well. Siblings, telepathy, all the, and all of those things to various extents are still present and correct in fan fiction. But they were very, very front and center in the US. A lot of Prime, Elita 1 stuff as well. And the UK fans, and again, you can work out why, because you've heard me blather on about it, but we were kind of rooted in the stories of the UK. And there's a whole other conversation about kind of transformative versus curatorial fandom as well. So, a tendency to order and organize and, put things in the right sequence versus a more kind of free-flowing, creative, imaginative stuff. So, yeah. So I'm glad there's lots of questions. I always feel bad, though. Right, so there's a couple there, and then there's a chap with the glasses behind.
Hi, sorry if my question's really boring. You had a picture of the Transformers and G.I. Joe crossover.
Yeah.
And it did make me think, because obviously crossovers are a thing that come up a lot today. And obviously I feel like when you ask fans, it can be quite polarizing. So as someone who's done research, would you say, like, are crossovers generally a net positive or a net negative for, like, fans to stay, like, what's the word? Like, fandom sustainability and growth?
So I think two things. One, I think there was a novelty to crossovers way back when that's now, that flavor's now been chewed out. It's a bit like multiverse stuff now. It's just been very played out, and kind of it doesn't really have the same hook. There's a law of diminishing returns, really, when you've got the 700th combination of these characters, whatever. And as a personal anecdote to answer your question, when Nick Roach and I did a Revolution, there was a proto-Hasbro-verse thing being built within IDW. So, you had all these, you had G.I. Joe and Transformers, fine, but you were going to bring in Visionaries, and you were going to bring in Mask, and other properties which maybe Hasbro hadn't owned back in the 80s, but now did. And so Nick and I reunited after Wreckers, and we were going to do a one-shot with the Scavengers, and we had to fold in Mask, and we had to fold in Action Force. And actually, it probably speaks to one of your questions as well. Very well received in the UK, that issue. Not so well received in America, actually, where they felt we were taking the mick. And we kind of were taking the mick. But we were also but it was done lovingly, and it was kind of, and we were, it's not as if we were protecting Transformers and saying, we treat Transformers with reverence, and the other licensed products are like silly. We were saying it's all silly, but it's all great because it's silly. So yeah, I think perhaps perhaps audience reaction depends on their experiences growing up and how they experienced the license growing up. But I suppose that the biggest argument against the most important thing with crossovers is, and it sounds really obvious, but there has to be a reason for telling that story other than just, wouldn't it be great if these characters and these characters were on the same page? Yes.
Thank you for bringing this insightful and amazing presentation. Thank you. Yeah. So if my memory serves me well, in the earlier part of your presentation, it was mentioned that some of the fans quitted Transformers because they didn't recognize the Transformers being the same as what they are familiar with. But then, over the years, Transformers has proven itself to be an IP that's ever-changing. They're ever bringing about new toy lines, new designs, and launching new continuities. So I wonder, what do you recognize as the kernel of Transformers? What defines Transformers that made it so unique and distinctive in its own way? And how has that been reflected in all the fan works? Thank you.
Okay, that's a big question. So, when you read about the genesis of Transformers and you go right back to the beginning, to the point where Hasbro hadn't even decided that it would be good versus evil. There was such colossally fundamental aspects to the franchise that had yet to be decided. Is it good and bad? Are the robots controlled by other people, or are they sentient? So the sentience hadn't been agreed. So it took a while. Well, there's a lot of big decisions which we take for granted now. That in hindsight, it's a very good thing that they made the right call. I think what gave Transformers strength in the early days was, funnily enough, because from the very beginning there was parallel narratives. So the cartoon was telling its own story, the comic was telling its own story. There was other more minor offshoots. In the UK, if you read the Ladybird books, they told another But that didn't seem to bother anybody, I mean, as I said earlier, that you'd have your favorite continuity, but you wouldn't be, you could understand why there was just different versions being told, right? And actually, so one of the secrets of Transformers' success, I think, actually has been the malleability of the concept, the fact that, you can have, a new TV show will come out and it will tell yet again another story. So I think there's been so many precedents set. I mean, there's a whole other conversation to have about how Hasbro tried to create, and to an extent did create a kind of canon. But generally, one of the strengths of the franchise is that it's multifaceted and it can go off in multiple directions at the same time. Lastly on that, I think just because the canvas is so massive, so they're functionally immortal people, there's a cast of millions, and it's space-wide. So there's so many opportunities for telling stories within that kind of milieu. Yes, now you with the green sweatshirt, because I keep missing you.
How did the franchise go from something which was being capitalized by fans, something which was again commercially viable, something which
So when did it go from being?
just being capitalized by
Oh, I see. So how did it come back? Yeah. Beast Wars was the first kind of spark. Generation 2 lasted 3 years, although the third year was truncated, and it did okay. They started. I mean, it gets quite detailed, but I mean, basically, Kenner, as part of Hasbro, Kenner developed what became Beast Wars, and it was, essentially a soft reboot. At the time, as you'll read in the book, it felt like an absolute fresh start. It felt like a hard reboot, and that alienated a lot of fans at the time. But it gave the franchise a shot in the arm. It proved, as I said, the malleability of the concept, because, particularly in the UK and Europe, Beast Wars wasn't heavily marketed as Transformers. It was Animutants and bioweaponry stuff. It was kind of Transformers, if anything, was kind of relegated to a little symbol on the bottom of the packaging. And Beast Wars did really well. Beast Machines didn't do too well. But when Beast Machines started to falter, Hasbro were already planning what became Armada, which actually is the kind of unsung other key factor in turning Transformers into like an evergreen brand. Beast Wars did well, but could have been kind of a freak occurrence. But Armada, and with it, the decision that Hasbro took to always have Transformers out there. They didn't want a repeat of what happened in '91 and most of '92 in America, where there was just nothing. So they resolved that there would always be something, and they kind of built in I mean, nobody wants anything to fail, but there was a resilience insofar as, okay, well, if this isn't super successful, there'll be something else coming along. And then, of course, you get to, as soon as Michael Bay gets involved, prior to 2007, because that's the release, so a couple of years before then, when a movie's coming up, then it just becomes, it builds up such a head of steam that it's always going to be some iteration of it out there somewhere.
I am sorry.
Yep, that's fine.
But unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you so much. Everybody give James a massive round of applause.
Thank you.